The China balloon. I'm sorry, the balloon from China, the Chinese balloon. Before we even get into the legalities of it, let's hear your take on which of the two narratives you believe, because there's two competing narratives. One is that this is a massive threat, Chinese spy balloon drifting over the Americas, whether or not it's looking for locations, infrastructure to target in the event of a third world war, whether it's looking for, nice green, lush farmland to purchase if you're China. One end of the narrative says massive threat, spy balloon, take it down, why it wasn't taken down earlier, yada, yada, yada. The other narrative is China saying it's a meteorological balloon that got blown off course, coming from China. No big deal. It happens all the time. And if you shoot it down, we're going to be livid and make it into a diplomatic affair. Between the two, I've skewed it. Which narrative do you go with in terms of being the more plausible narrative of what's going on?
Neither of those two, because we also have the narrative as to whether this happened during the Trump administration, and if it did, whether Trump knew about it, of which we received conflicting information over the last several days. Some evidence Mattis did know about it as Secretary of Defense. The Office of Director of National Intelligence, both John Radcliffe and his predecessor, Mike Pompeo at CIA, before he was at Secretary of State, said they did not know about it. So we'll see in due time what the truth is. But I think Alex Jones' takeaway was probably the most pertinent, which was he gave it its historical context, which is a lot of Americans don't know the Japanese launched a bunch of balloons intended to into the United States, or intended to reach the United States, intended to cause mass disaster, fires, all kinds of things. I think it was Fugu or something like that, Fugo. If someone's saying I mispronounced the Japanese, I'm sure I have, because I mispronounce English on a regular basis. But the most Americans don't know about it because the Office of Censorship, that was back when our government was honest. At least when they had an Office of Censorship, they called it Office of Censorship. They didn't call it something else. Told the media not to cover it. So many Americans to this day don't even know that happened. Even though these Japanese balloons have been discovered all over the United States and other places, they just weren't as successful as the Japanese hoped they would be, and for a range of reasons. But the big thing was the ability to have balloons last in the air, because usually what happens, these weather balloons go up, they gather the information, they go up too high, they blow up, they come down, they parachute whatever the database is back forward, or they already transmitted it electronically or digitally. The goal here was to have balloons last in the air, not go too high, and to have steerage capacity against various wind control. So this has been an experiment for a long time. The U.S. government has a Defense Department budget designed for this. Allegations that some of it was intended to be used for domestic spying purposes. The thing is, a balloon only has marginal utility as a spying technique over drones, satellites, and the like, spy planes and the like. Those are generally better. They're just a little more costly, and some, in the case of satellites, don't get to linger the way a balloon can. But very, very marginal utility, extra utility as that, and that's where some of the defenders of China, who are saying this was intended to provoke a response to China, etc., this was an overreaction by the United States. Now the flip side is that China's explanation and excuse that this was just unexpected winds didn't really make sense, because there were no unexpected winds. Yes, the winds would naturally take something in that direction, but they knew that when they launched the balloon. The idea that it's just a weather balloon isn't really quite consistent, given weather balloons don't take the path they took, and there's more evidence of deliberate steerage. The Chinese only said it had limited steerage. It didn't say it had none, and the evidence seemed to suggest it did have that capacity. The counter theory would be that with knowledge of this history of Japanese balloon weaponization, with knowledge that the U.S. government was trying to do its own balloon weaponization, and that there's a wing of the Defense Department that thinks that China is technologically illiterate when it comes to the defense industry. A lot of the same people who said the same thing about Russia, by the way, kept saying they're about to run out of weapons, but not around. So and I remember there was people on our board that were arguing with me about that China had no weapon system, that this was all exaggerated, that their nukes couldn't get out of their silos and all this stuff. Well, if you're China and you're on the eve of a summit and you want to make a point to the United States, one way to do so is to make a balloon that lingers right over the populace to where they can see it in a threatening way, so it has an effect on the population. And the other is that it have steerage capacity for weaponized purposes in the way that Japan tried but failed to do. And it would be China's way of saying, we in fact do have military technology you don't think we have. So maybe you should think twice before you double up your military stations and bases in the Philippines like we're currently doing this past week. So it wouldn't surprise me if this was a deliberate effort by China to say their military technology is much better than some parts of the Pentagon believe, as a method of deterrence from that wing of the Pentagon that wants to go to war, because this also came on the after it was leaked of U.S. military officials planning to go to full-scale war with China in 2025. Those plans are clearly being produced by elements of the Pentagon. And a large basis of it, as Colonel McGregor has pointed out, is the misunderstanding by a wing of the Pentagon that China is defensively weak militarily. He and others are suspect and skeptical of that military assessment by wings of the Pentagon. This balloon would clearly be testament to that.
People are saying electromagnetic pulse.
Yeah, that's one of the weapons that could be used. There's a range of weapons that a balloon could carry that doesn't have either the expense or other collateral difficulties in certain utilities. There's a reason why Japan was developing it, put it that way. I mean, in fact, it was the first intercontinental weapon system before we had intercontinental ballistic missiles, was the Japan balloon system. And it did travel across continents. It just didn't have the scale and scope of success the Japanese wanted it to.
Now, I had jokingly said in the early days, like, they're not shooting it down because they don't know what's in it. And what better deterrent? Well, I hadn't even thought about this, like, technologically, scientifically. What would be the possibility of delivering any form of anthrax, like any biological attack from a balloon event?
You could do. Absolutely. It's one of the things you could do. That was one of the things the Japanese were considering doing. Now, mostly they ended up using it for bomb purposes with the hope of lighting fires all over the United States. But it's not so much what it's delivering as the fact that they designed a delivery system that can do it in ways that would be, and I think that's why the U.S. military knocked it down, because before the U.S. military knocked it down, there was a lot of discussion out there in the military technology space that said it's actually very difficult to knock down a balloon at that height.
Well, you got Adam Kinzinger was all over Twitter saying, it's at 100,000 feet, you can't knock it down. And then people were like, dummy, it's at 60,000 feet, according to the Department of Defense. And then he's like, well, and then you had other people saying, it can't be done and it's dangerous to do it. And then
there is a very high failure rate with actually trying to knock it down. Now, I don't buy the Biden administration's belief, based on past shuttle issues and other things, that they were really worried about debris. I think they were worried that whatever the payload was would show up with some random farmer finding it, and that there would be something about that would be embarrassing to the Biden administration. So they shoot it down over the ocean, where there's no risk that Joe Schmo comes up with it, and most likely it will sink to the bottom of the ocean and never be discovered. But it's where I depart with my conservative friends, and my conservative friends saw it as weakness by the Biden administration. I don't necessarily. There's a wing of the Biden administration that wants war with China. And this will be inconceivable to a range of people in the conservative space. They won't understand that because they see Biden as the prostitute, if you will, in the relationship with China, and China's the pimp. They don't understand that the Bidens, the Pelosi's, et cetera, see China as the prostitute and they as the pimp. And that's why George Soros has been calling for regime change in China now for going on 5 years. And a lot of these warmongers want to force China to go back to being the servile factory worker they see them as, that the globalists see them as. And we're at real risk of escalatory conflict with China, and some conservatives, frankly, are playing into it. We don't want to go to war with China. There's Trump's policies are still the best ones, which is let's renegotiate trade. Let's not extend and expand their social credit system to the United States. Let's hold them accountable for whatever happened in the pandemic, including if it implicates Fauci and others. But let's not get involved in a land war in China.
Well, never get involved in a war. But I'm just trying to think, like, visualize, what does a war look like with China now? It would not be a question of anybody invading anybody's territory. It would be launching missiles.
The plans that have been leaked is the U.S. to invade China, to recolonize China, much like the 1800s, to go up and China has, as Colonel McGregor has pointed out, China is almost entirely defensively operated. It's not very offensively, or I think that's why they designed the balloon, is they wanted to say, we do have offensive capacity. You may not think we did, but they're obsessed with the memory of the 1800s, the Opium Wars, et cetera. I mean, people forget the Brits in the West forced opium on their population. That's still not processed by your average American. And so the Chinese people are deeply remember that. And so, as McGregor pointed out, if you really study their best military systems, they're designed defensively to prevent people going up the rivers again and being able to conquer the inside of China. They are still weak. They've launched another, airship, or that was the airship, the balloon. But I mean, they launched another air carrier, but they're still pretty weak in the naval side. I mean, they have some strength, and it's a little bit concerning that we keep expanding our military operations in the Pacific. I mean, it's like, what is our goal here? I mean, this looks like Ukraine all over again, where we keep doing military operations on Russia's doorstep. Now we're doing military operations on China's doorstep. What exactly? It's one thing to say we're going to defend Taiwan. It's another thing to have 8 military bases in the Philippines. It's another thing to want to be extending our naval operation in the South China Seas and the extended islands there. That's just provocative behavior that I think is unnecessary and is designed for war. But there are people who clearly think they can win that war, and a big predicate of it is they have big assumptions about China's military capacity. And I think that's a mistake. We made that mistake. We went into Korea. We tried to dominate North Korea. China sent a million plus soldiers, and we had to pull back to the 38th parallel.
I just conceptually don't understand how anybody could think you're going to invade a country of. Sure, they're not armed yet, but a country of nearly 2 billion people.
You can win a winter war in Russia. I mean, you have these so-called OSINT, they call them Bro-OISNT, is kind of a joke, open source intelligence people that are clearly affiliated and associated with deep state operatives and the like, or intelligence agencies, if you so choose, that are suggesting that Ukraine and the West can win a war in winter in Russia, even some suggesting Russia's not ready to handle war in winter. I guess they, skipped what, there was a meme around that had Napoleon, Hitler, and some past people who've tried to go into Russia in the winter and how that's been their demise. You would think we knew better, but McGregor's pointed out there's a wing in the Pentagon that thinks we can conquer the world, that there's a wing that's a lot like the post-World War II era of generals that wanted to nuke everybody. Curtis bombs away LeMay, who, even George Corley-Wallace had to keep apologizing for in 1968. And he didn't really mean that. He didn't really mean that. There's a reason for the movies like Dr. Strangelove and the like. They represented actual people in the military hierarchy who wanted. I mean, MacArthur wanted to use nuclear weapons against China during the Korean War. So, Patton wanted to go into Russia after the Soviet Union at the end of World War II. So there was, though Patton was nowhere, Patton was just aggressive as opposed to MacArthur and LeMay, 2 of whom have been icons in parts of the conservative movement, the more militaristic conservative movement, who are in denial about how nuts these people were. And a good number of them are still in positions of power. And they're willing to do 2 wars at once with the 2 other great nuclear powers of the world, Russia and China. That's how crazy aspects of the Biden administration actually are.
At least we don't have mean tweets, Robert. It's but speaking of not having Trump in office, so what is this rubbish? It starts out as it literally starts out as, well, there was a balloon here, but we had 3 of them during the Trump presidency, and then it was like, 3 during the Trump presidency. Then it comes out that perhaps Trump, if it did happen, Trump was never told about it by the same military or by the same defense entity that also lied to Trump about the number of U.S. soldiers remaining in Syria. What is up with that story? What is the truth, and what is just created afterwards to make Biden look less bad?
We don't know. We know the ODNI directors denied it. There's the Office of Directors of National Intelligence. We know that there's a story out there that Mattis knew about it and hid it from Trump. What I would say is it wouldn't surprise me if the military had multiple reasons for hiding it. So, for example, the military was bragging this week about testing our hypersonic weapons, our first ever hypersonic missile. What's ironic about that is, of course, Russia has actually been using hypersonic missiles in Ukraine for the last 6 months. I remember at the beginning of the conflict, a bunch of the same folks saying that Russia had no such weapons. that they couldn't, that if the U.S. doesn't have it, nobody has it. And I think it was embarrassing. It would have been embarrassing that China had developed this military technology or technology that could be used for military purposes before the U.S. had, when part of the Pentagon's whole pitch was we can go into China without worrying too much because their technology is so backwards on an advanced military scale. And there's still people out there that claim that economically. And sometimes they make good arguments, and sometimes I think they overstate their claim. But I think there needs to be a balance reached between not deferring to aggression from any foreign nation, while at the same time not letting it, provoke people into doing something. I think that it's sort of an excuse to cover for why Biden didn't knock it down right away. When I think the real excuse was the U.S. military didn't want anybody, and the Biden administration didn't anybody want them finding whatever was that was being carried on that airship for whatever reason. There's something there that they're bothered by, and I don't think we'll ever get the whole story for decades to come.
All right. Well, that might leave more questions than answers for some people, but that is it. If it were to be,
this balloon never goes down. That's Elon Musk's ability to win incredible cases at trial.